Nice to see everybody. Friends, it's my pleasure this evening to be able to introduce our speaker, Father Johann Roten, SM. He's an internationally acclaimed authority in the theology of Mary, as well as Mary in the history of cultural traditions worldwide, in dimensions ranging from the political to the artistic, as will soon be evident. Father Roten has a special interest in and knowledge of how cultures throughout the world see the birth of Christ and express their faith and cultural perspective in the form of nativities or creches. Father Roten is Swiss by birth, but his international cultural outreach and his cosmopolitan ease is perhaps most forcefully exemplified by the number of languages he can speak beyond his native Swiss German, including English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch, Latin, Greek, Polish, Hungarian, and Lithuanian. Father Roten headed the International Marian Research Institute and Library at the University of Dayton for 15 years before accepting his current role there as Director of Research and Special Projects. Father Roten is a prolific writer, and just in the past 2 years, one can find on his CV 6 scholarly articles in 3 languages with an average page length of 50 pages on topics ranging from Marian feasts, Mary and ecclesiology, Mary and anthropology, Mary in romantic and pietist traditions, etc., as well as a short popular monograph and a collection of meditations on new nativity sets for the purposes of display. Added to these accomplishments, one could remark, too, that as a former student of Benedict XVI, Father Roten has also published commentary on his theology. He will speak to us tonight on the topic as displayed from Epinal to Plateau d'Assy, religious art and the Marian century. So please join me in welcoming Father Roten.
Let me begin by telling you how much I enjoy the fact to be here. Especially, it's always a good experience to find like-minded people, meaning people who commit themselves to the knowledge, the love, and also the service of Our Lady. And I think coming from Dayton, from the International Marian Research Institute, it's a real joy to have that kind of echo working with Dr. Cavallini and all of the ones who are immediately related to the Institute, and not only to the Institute, but also to the different activities of that institution. What I would like to do tonight is actually something that I had to achieve by resisting some temptations. The first temptation was to tell you, and maybe this applies a little bit to the present situation. My first temptation was to tell you, let's walk out of this hall and walk across campus. Let's, in a special way, go to the Institute of Ethic and Culture and open the doors and look at the art of Ivan Mestrovich. Because if you look at the art of Mestrovich, in a certain sense, he summarizes much of what we'll be talking about, meaning the art, certain expressions of the art between 1900 and 1950, since, as you know, Ivan Mestrovich, Croatian artist, actually died here at South Bend in 1962. And we know that all across campus we do have some of his major works. Now, I resisted that temptation. But there was another one, and that other one has to do with the art situation here in the United States. You know that between 1937 and 1970, there was a Catholic Art Association. It would have been interesting to relive that history, although I have to say that that particular history is a somewhat painful one. It started in 1937, then after the war reformulated, reorganized, reached a certain growth, but then there was a downward spiral all to the end of that association in 1907. This having been said, I finally decided to opt for a broader historical and motivational context and to include both devotional and artistic Marian art in this presentation. That's the reason why we do have those two French locations from Epinal to Plateau d'Assy, or if you want highlights in some of the more representative samples and ways of looking at Marian art up to the eve of Vatican II. My talk will be organized according to 5 little chapters, some of them a little bit longer. The first one, I called it the theo-aesthetic situation, nothing to do with Balthasar. The second one, Epinal and Assy, the meaning of those terms. The third one, the devotional image, a linear development. The fourth one, the artistic image, contrasts and complementarity. And the fifth one, 3 conclusions. Let me begin with my first point, which indeed is not immediately artistic, but it gets there. I would like to highlight what I call the theo-aesthetic situation. Should I have been asked to formulate the major trends in Marian studies at the eve of Vatican II, I would have suggested 6 of them. The first one, the search for and the discussion regarding a fundamental principle in Mariology, triggered by Scheben in the mid-19th century, but remaining a largely open and undecided issue at the time of Vatican II. Second, the shift from a Christotypical perspective in Mariology to the new, old perspective of ecclesiotypical Mariology, and with it the retrieval of Mary as archetype and supereminent member of the Church. A third trend, the culmination of the so-called privilege Mariology, and its hotly debated doctrinal questions of mediation and co-redemption, in the queenship of Mary and the dogmatization of the Assumption, the latter unfortunately without any major theological and pastoral consequences. The fourth trend, the rediscovery of the historical context in Mariology, and herewith the challenges of Bible, culture, ecumenism, and liturgy, husbanded in the famous plan of God, becoming salvation history, perspective, in the chapter 8 of Lumen Gentium. It opened the way to a pronounced anthropological orientation of Mariology. A fifth trend, the intense and multifaceted devotional atmosphere centered in major apparitions, La Salette, Lourdes, Fatima, not to forget Guadalupe, the perduring effect and impact of the Immaculate Conception, the Rosary, and a host of Marian spiritualities and devotions promoted by religious congregations and related movements. And the sixth trend, the strong social definition of the Marian movement in the new Catholic action and old structures, sodalities, linking personal spirituality and apostolic endeavor under the aegis of both the strong woman and the eternal feminine. It lost its dynamic acumen after Vatican II to become a largely therapeutic Madonna. Now, it would seem that there exists some obvious similarities between the six general trends in Mariology and Marian art at the eve of Vatican II. First of all, we discover a tendency toward the foundational, the essential image of Mary in devotional as well as in artistic imagery. Secondly, Marian imagery imitating the new ecclesiotypical perspective appears more integrated and relational, embedded in various historical and cultural contexts. A third observation. There persists in an evident mediating quality in Marian art relating ideal and real, remote but powerful, a Marian image oscillating between this and otherworldliness. Number 4, the devotional dimension finds artistic expression in some of the pronounced subjective and affectively tinted Marian representations. 5, the exotic and cultural image opens up new social and sociological horizons. And 6, the theological image, as we will show, reflects some of the building stones of what we call salvation history perspective in Mariology. Now, it may be true that art imitates life. It does not mean that art replicates a hastily put together typology of theological endeavors. Therefore, a necessary caveat applies. I would like these characteristics and comparisons I just made to be understood not as conclusions hewn in stone or immemorialized on canvas, but as a reading hypothesis for what follows. And so let us begin with the title, From Epinal to Plateau d'Arcy. Epinal is a town in northeast France. It was famous at one time for the mass production of images, religious imagery in particular. It had reached the zenith of its commercial glory in the mid-19th century, coinciding somewhat with the beginning of what we call the Marian century. Widely disseminated, creating and publicizing the notion of popular art and holy cards, the art of Epinal was vilified as kitsch at one time, but seems to experience a new presence and popularity. Plateau d'Arcy, on the other hand, is a small town in southeastern France, looking down on Chamonix, a famous resort place, and looking up to the Mont Blanc, the highest mountain in Europe. Plateau d'Arcy, with a simple parish church, Notre de Toute Grâce, which becomes toward the end of the Marian century a laboratory of contemporary religious art with the the contribution of renowned artists such as Léger, Rouault, Chagall, Lipchitz, Matisse, Bonnard, Lussard, and Richier. Now, thanks to the initiative of two Dominicans, that laboratory sees the light of day and continues for some time. These two Dominicans, well known, Marie-Alain Couturier and Pierre Raymond Régamay. Now, this experiment will be of short duration, much discussed and eventually abandoned, but will create a new consciousness and understanding of sacred art, especially thanks to Pope Paul VI. Today, Plateau d'Assy is at the same time a museum of all of that art, as well as, unfortunately, also what we might call a mausoleum. So let us begin with Epinal then and now. What I would like to highlight is the tenacity of popular image between the time of 1850 to the present. And I would like you to take a closer look at what I call art for the heart. There is a collage of 4 of those products of Epinal art, and they represent 4 of the important characteristics of Epinal art. The image to your left, Sommeil de Jésus, the sleep of Jesus, highlights the down-to-earth, childlike approach to popular art. Here, in particular, highlighting the humanity of the baby Jesus needing his sleep. The second important characteristic, the second image from left, the kind of moralizing aspect and dimension of that art. Here, in particular, baby Jesus lifts his arm in order to let everybody know, pay attention, this is the mother, the Mater Dei. She is the mother of God. A third very important aspect in this type of art is the tendency toward composite images. Like you see it in Notre Dame de Bon Secours, it's actually an image where you have the Mantle Madonna, you have an allusion to the heart of Mary, you have the crescent moon under her feet, allusion to the Immaculate Conception. Quite frequently, Epinal art tries to bring together different, complementary up to a certain point, characteristics and motifs in their representation of Mary. The fourth one of those images, the Immaculate Conception, is a typical image well known all through the second half of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century as the characteristic image linking simultaneously on the one hand the powerful woman, she is standing on the dragon, and on the other hand the ethereal woman, the feminine, the eternal feminine, if you want. Important to remember when we look at these pictures, this is industrialized art. It's art that brings the church to the home, and it has also an aspect of pedagogy, or if you want, religious instruction. Quite frequently, as you can intuit, you don't see it properly, prayers would be added to the pictures or explanations as to the content of those different holy cards, as we sometimes call them. Now, talking about the other end of the title, which is Plateau d'Assy. As I mentioned, it's a laboratory. It's at the same time the end of a new beginning, and it lasts from 1935 to 1955. Marian art in the Marian century evolves between Epinal, the beginning and as devotional image, and Plateau d'Assy, the end of the period, and the artistic image. I would like to illustrate these developments with two series of images. One, a series of devotional images, and secondly, a series of artistic images of Mary. In order to show a certain progression in Marian art, I will apply a linear method to the devotional images, and the artistic image will be presented according to a comparative approach, highlighting contrasts and complementarity. The comparative method will help us to better appreciate the variety, the riches, and the challenges of the artistic image and its consequences for Marian art at the eve of Vatican II. So before we move into the linear development of the devotional image, briefly, in order to highlight the laboratory of Plateau d'Assy, here you have the church in front of you. As you can see, a fairly simple church built in the late 40s of last century. You will recognize or have recognized on the facade the Litany of Our Lady by Fernand Léger, which highlights, if you want, a typical image of that particular time. And you have an aperçu of the choir or the sanctuary of that particular church, which is literally filled with images, paintings, sculptures of the artist I had mentioned. When you look at the picture in front of you, you would see to your very left a typical Matisse Saint-Dominique. If you look at the far right, you will see a painting by Bonnard, Francis de Sales, and in particular, at the very center, you have Jean Lursa's tapestry of the apocalyptic woman. And this is not everything, but it's just a way of highlighting how many different ways the contemporary art contributed to highlighting certain aspects of Mary. I may want to add here very briefly that the two Dominicans, Régamey and Couturier, invited artists who were not necessarily believers, artists who were very well known at that particular time. The idea was, let's bring church and art together. And that was their way of doing it. Now, coming back to the devotional image, what I'm going to be showing are stages of development. They are based on a research we were able to do some 6 years ago at Dayton by submitting a whole series of pictures to students, related people, people local and people national, but also international, in order to determine but what are or what were the typical devotional images when we look at the 2 centuries, meaning the 19th and the 20th century. So we have on the one hand, if you want a sociological approach, on the other hand, if you want the art historical one. And here is the result we came up with, that all through the 19th century and the 20th century, when I say 19th century, thinking about, 1830, Miraculous Medal, But all the way to the eve of Vatican II, the typical devotional image is the so-called apparition image, as highlighted here in the Miraculous Medal, in Lourdes, and in Fatima. What is typical of that particular image is the fact that we are talking about an autonomous image, meaning a consequence of, if you want, the Counter-Reformation picture of the Queen of Heaven, which then is being sweetened, if I may call it like that, during the apparition time, a representation of Mary without the baby Jesus. For good measure, I threw in, if you want, another Orans, namely Our Lady of Sorrow, and at the same time also a Temple-Jung Virgin, which goes back to the 16th century. All in a position which we call in iconography as the Orantia, the one who is either praying or in and through her prayer, connecting and mediating people with God. The perduring image, therefore, when looking at the beginning of the 20th century, we encounter an image which we call image of abstract sensuality, meaning that in that particular typically devotional image, you have those sweet pink and blue pastel colors, the sweet shallowness of its design, and the quasi-ethereal femininity of Mary. Now, this idealized rendering has a strong emotional appeal, not least because of the impression of the simultaneous presence, which is colorful, subdued, sensuous up to a certain point, and absence, meaning it's still a remote and abstract and untouchable quality that comes through this particular image, which does not mean that that particular image would be without any relation with living humanity. On the contrary, it's a mediating image which shows these two qualities, but still make sure that the contact with God as the mediating image is safeguarded. Sometime later, we have the development of what we call the Hollywood realism. You have in front of you a Christmas card, 1955, due mainly to the influence of the religious film. Since the 30s and the 40s of last century, a new devotional type emerged. It was largely a product of what we like to call Hollywood realism. The representation of Mary is cast in historical or modern-day setting and posture. The facial expression are those of an actress, quite frequently, as can be shown here. I'll let you find out which one she represents, and correspond to the aesthetic canon of the times, especially those of the movie industry. Hollywood realism succeeds in bringing Mary down to earth by making her into an object of our leisure culture. It also transforms the form of the unreachable ideal of the past and makes it, unfortunately sometimes, into a glamorous but artificial idol. So much for the time in, I would say, at the eve of Vatican II, but immediately afterwards, and sometimes simultaneously, we have what we call the elementary Madonna. In the 50s and early 60s, the artistic creed of Expressionism caught up with devotional art and provoked a rupture. And that rupture actually produces what you have in front of you, in order to really attract people's attention to what is essential in the image of Mary, everything that could be of some individual, particular expression of that image is being taken away in order to confront people with those stark lines of what the artist sometimes considers as being the essential elements. It would be up to the individual to come and in and through his or her liberty to paint or to add whatever particular and individual traits they would like to add. This particular tendency is not of long duration. Shortly afterwards, in the mid-70s, we discover the typical image of the pop Madonna, meaning it's an expression of reaction and rejection of the previous image, and at the same time it's a way of using typical styles of that time, namely pop art, folk art, and the ever-growing presence of Eastern iconography. So you have on the one hand a certain childlikeness, on the other hand also, if you want, a fairly recognizable, identifiable image contrary to what we had before. In the most recent period, meaning after 1982, especially coming out of France, but not only and exclusively, you have what we call the image of unanimity. This becomes, if you want, a new type of image, not only and exclusively devotional, but also frequently a liturgical image, which seeks some kind of a unanimity among the people who are looking at that image. It would like to appeal simultaneously to the individual, but also to the community, especially the liturgical community. And so the image of unanimity holds the middle ground between plain abstract and exaggeratedly, figurative qualities. It would like to appeal to both the individual and the community. So much for that short, if you want, linear development of what we call the devotional image. But let us now look at the artistic image, which would be more of a non-linear approach, an exercise in contrast and complementarity. The artistic image will be conveyed with the with 10 representative motifs of Marian art, presented in a somewhat dialectical fashion, and illustrated with a gallery of 20 known artists. And so we have a very surprising discovery that can be made all through, I would say, the 19th century and part up to the eve of Vatican II, part of the 20th century. It may be surprising to you or to all of us that the very persistent image in 19th and 20th century art, and I'm talking about the artistic image, is the Raphael Madonna. It's the expression and at the same time the measure of beauty. You see it in the way in which it is used by artists. You discover it also when, sociologically speaking, you try to find out what is for specific people the canon of beauty when talking about Mary. And it is this particular, not this particular, but it is the Raphael Madonna, considered simultaneously as a certain ideal of beauty, and at the same time also safeguarding a realism which, as you will see, will not find in all of the art presented. This Madonna Tempi image can be indeed verified, but not only the Madonna Tempi, also La Belle Jardinière, for instance, in two interesting examples. This ideal and real image, we find it in and through the Nazarenes. Here, for instance, Franz Pohr, 1811. What he represents is Italy and Germany. On your left side, you have Shulamit, reference to the Song of Songs. There you have a typical reproduction, if I may say, of La Belle Jardinière of Raphael. It's the sweet life of the southern regions of Europe, something the Germans usually and all through history had been aspired to. Whereas on your right, you have the representation of what he calls Maria. She is the meditative one. She is the one who is the counterpart to Shulamit. Now, if you look at the faces, the coloring, the postures, those are all typically Raphael Madonnas. Or if we go to France and look into some of the things that Jean-Dominique Ingres had done, and again, it is fairly early in the 19th century, you will find one of the most popular images in France, even now, namely the so-called vow of Louis XIII, which was an opportunity for him to consecrate the whole of France to Our Lady. But if you look at the picture, you will very definitely recognize that this here is nothing else but the so-called Sistine Madonna of Leipzig, which was so much liked by Dostoevsky and by Bulgakov, as a matter of fact. Again, Ingres, who has some very typical images of Mary, he uses something that is considered as being the canon of beauty. It's the Raphael Madonna, here the Sistine Madonna, as I call it. In other words, the persistence of a certain way of looking at beauty in the Raphael Madonna, and you will see that even Salvador Dali, at the end of our period, will be using the Raphael Madonna in order to highlight some of his own painterly ideology, I call like that. The second important image, or if you want, motif, I would like to present here, is the motif of a powerful and essential image. There is a search for a new authenticity, and that new authenticity will create what we call the Western icon. And it can be illustrated in and through two painters, one Henri Matisse and the other one Georges Rouault, in different ways. Now here you have the famous Chapel of Vence in southern France. You see those very simple, very essential lines, typical for Matisse in his later years. I even added, in order to show how this here sometimes functioned, the artist at his work. But again, the idea is, let's get rid of everything that is accidental. Let's go back to the very essential things that we need to know about Our Lady. Here, for instance, to your right, the relationship between Mary and her child, and at the same time, the fact that she is Our Lady of the Way. She presents the child to the world. In other words, the discovery of or the need to discover an essential image which comes again around that time, 1950. That chapel was built in the 40s and was illustrated by Matisse in the early 50s of late last century. On the other hand, as a complement to what we just saw, here one of the images of the famous Miserere made by Georges Rouault, and he actually found a very significant title to that image. He calls it Our Lady of the End of the World, but vigilant for us. Again, if you look at the type of imagery, it's stark lines, it's a powerful woman, but again, the tendency goes toward looking for the essential traits of that image. Second motif, therefore. Now let's go on to a third one, namely what we could call the image of Mary torn and worn, but still strong. What I would like to highlight is the fact that all through the first period of the 20th century, especially after the Great War, one of the most persistent, popular, and omnipresent images is the Pietà as a memento of two world wars. I have two images, one going back to before the Great War, 1912, here by Emile Noldi, the Entombment, and the blue figure to your right is the figure of Mary. As you can see, those are very torn, very worn figures. They highlight either anticipation of some of the difficulties that will come with the First World War, or in a more generic way, the typical approach of expressionism to art, which wants to disassemble as much as possible, if you want, organize the human form in order to reconstitute it. We have a typical and extreme example in Picasso, but you have all through 20th century expressionism this tendency to find the ultimate expression, the essence of the human person. One example, the other example, much easier to maybe understand and to appreciate, the famous Jacob Epstein, here with his London War Memorial, 1947, to highlight again the idea of the Pietà. But quite frequently a secularized Pietà, because this here is not so much Mary, but it is Britannia, the mother of the motherland, holding on her knees or in her arms the dead armies of different countries. And there's hardly in Europe, especially France and Germany, a village or a town where you don't have the representation of the Pietà in this kind of form. Secularized image, but again, the reversal is always possible, to read into that image or out of that image or with that image the true sense of what the Pietà stands for. There's a different type of motif. I called it explaining and pointing, or if you want, the theological image of Mary. Those images are not very numerous, but there's some artists who have specialized in highlighting specific theological questions and to put them into their art form, be it expressionistic, be it abstract, different ways of dealing with it. I have chosen two of these artists, Maurice Denis and Albert Servais. The first one a Frenchman, the second one a Belgian. And here you have the example of Maurice Denis. He is one of those artists of the late 19th century and the very first part of the 20th century who wants to bring new life into art. He founded a bulletin called Art Sacré. And one of his tendencies precisely is to give more theological quality to the image. So you have in front of you something that's quite famous, the so-called Catholic mystery. There are at least half a dozen versions of this same painting. He painted it repeatedly. This here goes back to 1889. And what you see there is, on the one hand, Mary as the image of the church. On the other hand, you see what I would call the Christus totus. And I would like to explain that. You see Mary seated. It's the situation, according to Maurice Denis, of the Annunciation. You see approaching that particular figure, the sitting figure, a priest with an open book preceded by two choir boys and in their hands lit candles. In other words, it's the church who comes or which comes to the church. Mary is the church in her body, in her womb, the presence of Jesus Christ, the incarnation. And you have at the same time the teaching, the reading church, the open book. In other words, this particular theological message tells us that in order to have the Christus totus, you need his person in the womb of Mary, and you need his teaching or his work symbolized in the book that the priest holds in his hand. To look at a different but very interesting way of highlighting another theological problem or issue, Albert Servais, he had been called the Fra Angelico of Expressionism. Lots of Marian and religious images, very tortured sometimes, but highly symbolic. On the other hand, you have to your right the representation of Mary, the mediatrix, Maria Middelaris, Belgian. She is the one who points to the Son, to Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ, if you take a look at his right hand, points to the Father. The whole of mediation is, if you want, the interplay between Mary, her Son, and the Father. What's so interesting about this particular approach in 1933 is the rendering of the same thing, much more figurative, of course, by Filippino Lippi, 1495, where Mary points with her left hand to her breast in order to remind her son, I'm your mother. And the son points with his left hand to the open side in order to remind the father that he's the one who gave his life for the people who are back there, underneath Mary. She points with her right hand to the people who ask for her mediation. So you have, at a distance of quite a few centuries, two different ways of highlighting a theological issue. Here, in this particular case, the mediation of Mary. But there is another very interesting motif I'd like to mention, namely the Marian image, which is illustrative and inspiring at the same time. I'd like to talk about the narrative image of Mary, and there are two representatives which I would like to present, illustrate. Gustav Doré on the one hand, and Julius Schnorr von Karlsfeld. In other words, a Frenchman and a German Nazarene artist with their own ways of highlighting the narrative image. There's hardly a painter of the 19th century who has had more influence of generations of people, and especially illustrations in books and missals than Gustave Doré. Tissot is another one, but I've chosen Gustave Doré. And his whole approach is to put the people of the Bible in local garb to go toward an image which is simple as possible, so that the essential gestures and action can be highlighted without difficulty. In other words, what he did was to create a Bible illustré, illustrated Bible. And here you have the image of the flight into Egypt. In other words, it's illustrative art, used in manuals, missals of all kind. If you look at the more German approach to the same idea, because Schnorr von Karlsberg, he actually made the same thing, 240 of those Bible illustrations. But his is a little bit more poetic. It's a little bit more, if you want, inspiring. Here, out of a less documentary, if you want, intent, more an inspirational one, he highlights the parents of John visiting with the parents of Jesus. But there's also an exotic and cultural image which needs to be mentioned at that particular time. The cultural image is full of intuitions, if you want, of a new universality. It actually has to do, in part, with the very strong missionary impetus in the second half of the 19th century, and of course also the first part of the 20th century. And I've chosen two of these images, one of them very well known, Paul Gauguin, without any missionary intent, but his sojourn in Tahiti actually gave him the opportunity to change completely the Marian image, put it in a completely different cultural context, and also the way in which it is, sociologically speaking, again, culturally speaking, the image highlights, if you want, the local custom, which in this particular image is represented in and through the fact that mothers would carry their infants up to the age of 3 years. So there you have Maria Orana, Ya Orana Maria, rather, which is a way of telling people you have to look beyond your Western categories in order to bring, if you want, Christianity into a new cultural context. This kind of tendency, which will initiate a process of inculturation, is highlighted by a different artist, a wonderful one, who during all of his professional period or artistic period, beginning in 1947, because that's the first image that had been officially recognized by the Tokyo show of those of that type of images, actually stenciled on what they call crumpled paper. The other one, the Marian one, the Annunciation, is more recent. It goes into the 60s, 67. But what's so interesting here is that Sadao Watanabe says Christianity is a religion for the people. It's a religion for the simple people. That's the reason why I would like to apply to my art what he calls the Minye philosophy. Minye philosophy in Japan at a particular time says beauty is not in the skill of the artist, it's in the grace of God. And everything that is simple and down to earth is reality and truth, and it is in and through that kind of approach that you can find the imagery of Sadao Watanabe coming very close and correspond in his mind to what we call Christianity, the religion for the simple people. Now, approaching the end of that series here, I'd like to highlight also the fact that there is a change in personality as we talk about Our Lady and go through our time frame. On the one hand, the image of Mary can be diaphanous. On the other hand, it will more and more become bold. Therefore, a change in personality. Here, two examples, Dante Gabriele Rossetti and Henry O. Tanner. The first one certainly frequently seen and pictured. Dante Gabriele Rossetti, Ecce Ancilla Domini, 1850. The angel is his own brother, William. You have on your right there on a stand the stole that Mary embroidered in a different picture of 1849. You see the kind of, if you want, fear on her face. It's a symphony in white. In other words, a highly diaphanous representation of Mary. And I don't want to go into too many specifics because there are more symbols there than what meets the eye. But I think it's important that we keep in mind this diaphanous, weak, if you want, somewhat remote character of woman at that particular time, which corresponds to one type, the so-called intimist picture of women, independently from religious art, something that was very particular and popular around the change of the century, especially in symbolist art. Contrasting with Henry O. Tanner, we have seen that on missals recently, the Annunciation, 1898, where you have a different approach. It's the typically Mid-Eastern one. The angel is absent. There is this kind of growing light that is in approach to Mary. She is maybe fearful up to a certain point, but at the same time expresses a certain boldness. Therefore, diaphanous and bold, a change in the personality of the representation of Mary as we approach the mid-20th century. Also, along the same lines, bodily and spiritual, we find an oscillation between those two aspects, going back and forth. It's an ongoing movement, but it has specific expressions during our period. And I would like to present you with the only Van Gogh Marian depiction, which is actually a copy of a Pietà painted by Delacroix but Vincent van Gogh repaints it, uses his own colors, blue and yellow, and gives the whole expression a very powerful message. The message of the mother actually holds the body of her son and remonstrates to the onlooker that it's not because of her, but it's because of everybody else, or because of us, the sinners, that Christ died. So a very powerful and colorful image on the one hand. On the other hand, beginning of the 20th century and way into the 20th century, you have that famous school of Beuron, which is, again, one of those monasteries of artists. Peter Lenz, for instance, Jan Berkhad. They go back to Egyptian art. It's flat art. It's very stylized art. It's art that actually appeals to the purity of religion and therefore also the purity of the art. You can see that in many, many holy cards of the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s of the 20th century. Still hieratic and human, the sculpture between grandeur and human drama. Here, in order to highlight that indeed, sculpture has a role to play. You have this particular very powerful image of Henry Moore, Madonna and Child, from the very famous church of Northampton, had been bombed during the war, reconstructed, and one of the most important sculptures is that of Henry Moore. Contrasted by Jacob Epstein, the Madonna and Child, 1927. If the other one is powerful, rounded, complete, in a certain sense perfect, here you have the more worn, the more expressionist painting, meaning the mother who expects her son to leave her soon. She is in a position of holding him back. At the same time, she knows that we'll have to let him go. There you have very dramatic faces, the child as well as the mother. Complementarity between, if you want, these two. The Madonna and Child, to Henry Moore, and Jacob Epstein and his Madonna and Child. The last one in that series, before we come to a conclusion, what I would call the hidden and dissolving Madonna. It's a typically symbolic image, and I would like to give you two examples, one going back to the beginning of the 20th century, the other one situated around our time, the eve of the Council, the end of the 40s. So we do have, first of all, Franz Marc. You know that Franz Marc is a member of the so-called Blue Rider, and his whole intent is to find the essential form of horses and foxes. But in 1912, he spends vacation in Tyrol, and there he has some kind of a premonition. It's an apocalyptic image which anticipates the end of a culture, probably the beginning of a war. It's extremely intuitive, but you see how the trees are flattened, the houses are flattened, the animals that you can see down the lower part of the image. What is so interesting about it, a year later in 1213, he goes back to Tyrol, he goes back to the painting, and he pencils in the painting a figure, which is the figure of Our Lady. I don't know if there you have Our Lady of the Mantle. No, here. And believe me, this is not my invention, but he comments upon this painting, saying, the only one that can keep together, that world which is falling apart and flying, in all kinds of direction, is Our Lady. That is the reason why he presents us with this kind of surreal, if you want, presentation. But he baptizes it like that, Mary holding together the world that is prone to collapse, to dispersion. The other image of a different kind, going in opposite direction, is a painting that, if I'm well informed, or still is at the same place, is at Marquette, namely Salvador Dali's Notre Dame of Port-Ligat. Port-Ligat is the northern region of Coruña, where Franco spent his vacation. And it's also, if you want, the homeland of Salvador Dali. What you have in front of you is the altarpiece, again with the Raphael Madonna. The figures are practically, if you want, empty, or the big holes in those figures. The altarpiece is flying in all kinds of direction. He gives a commentary to that, and the commentary is the following. In and through the incarnation, the worldview that we have expanded and became infinite, as he calls it, and he would like to highlight that in and through, if you want, the coastline that you see in the back. In other words, symbolic image, Mary holding together a world in disrepair. And on the other hand, Mary and the child literally exploding the universe in order to bring people to a better recognition of what the sacred, or if you want, the infinite highlights. And, Salvador Dali, with his limp watches, we see quite frequently in his paintings, he had been, of course, some kind of an actor in many ways, but this here, he seemed to have set, out of the bottom of his heart and the best of his knowledge. Those are, if you want, the 10 different motifs that I was able to gather for this presentation. Of course, there are more, but these are certainly among the most important ones. It's the reason why at the end of that presentation, I would like to finish with 3 important conclusions, which apply to both the devotional aspect and as well as to the artistic image. Something very striking when you look at the development of art in the 19th and 20th century, you come to the conclusion that we have 2 contradictory movements. From the triumph of religion in the arts in the mid-19th century to the triumph of art in religion. Let me show you this here. If you look at that picture, which is undoubtedly, if you want, a copy but transformed of the famous Raphael Disputa on the Holy Sacrament, it becomes for Johann Friedrich Overbeck the triumph of religion in the arts. And he would say it is Mary and the child that actually is the most important source of inspiration for the arts. That is, if you want, the triumph of religion in the arts. We're talking about mid-19th century. What happens shortly before the mid-20th century? we have Max Ernst, the Virgin Spanx, the Son of Man before three witnesses. And you see the three witnesses back there in the window. One of them is Max Ernst himself. The other one is André Breton, who is the founder of the Surrealist movement. And the third one is Éluard, the French poet of the first half of the 20th century. What we're looking at here is secularization. It is, if you want, the disappearance of the mystery. It's a way of lifting the veil on the humanity, all too human, of the character of Our Lady and that of her boy, the baby Jesus. It's an appropriation of religion through the arts, in other words. There you have that, double movement. On the one hand, religion is the main inspiration for the art. On the other hand, it is indeed the arts that exploits religion. And then you have a second general conclusion, only three of them, that Marian art, 19th, 20th century, oscillates between Romanticism and Expressionism. I'd like to highlight that in and through two images again. Philippe de Ronge, The Rest of Flight into Egypt. It's a typical romantic image. You see the infinity of the landscape. You see the inbreaking of the light. You see this very domestic, if you want, rest on the flight to Egypt. Joseph taking care of the fire. The baby lying on the veil of Mary, looking up into the tree. And there you have the allegorical element, so typical of Romanticism. In other words, it's the new tree of life. It's the new tree of life of a new humanity. So growing out of that tree, but as consequence of the Passion and the Cross, you have, if you want, incipient figures of that new life. Romanticism is very realistic on the one hand, it's nature-related, and it is at the same time also allegorical. But if you go to the other end of the whole development, you have Expressionism, and there we go back, we're coming around, full circle. This is Plateau Assis. Jacques Lipschick, fairly well known also here in the United States, he had been asked to build a sculpture as a top of the baptismal fonts. So what he did is the representation of Notre de Liesse, meaning Our Lady of Joy, and it is a combination of Mary and the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit descending on Mary as the love of God represented in the heart, the figure of Mary in the center, completely permeated by the Spirit, and underneath some animals in order to highlight that the new world, the world of the love of God, includes all different expressions of life, animals are included. So therefore, the Marian picture between Romanticism and Expressionism as typical of that time. And finally, a synthesis ever present. I'd like to highlight that. If you ask the question, what is the permanent, the ever-present, and the most significant image in Marian art during that particular time, it is without doubt mother and child. So three images going back to the beginning. Priscilla, the fresco there. Secondly, since we talked much about Raphael, the Madonna Tempi, once again. and a modern, contemporary of last century, a representation of mother and child by Chagall, 1911. This to highlight that notwithstanding all the changes, all the different expressions, all the different cultural influences, all the theological imprints on the art, one thing that always remains and is, in a certain sense, the synthesis of Christianity as such. It's the representation of mother and child. God becoming one of us, making himself little, small, the kenosis, in order to make sure that the human person achieves the stature that person should achieve in and through the fact that it is he or she in the likeness of God himself. And so, conclusion, mother and child, very definitely a way of purduing presence of the Marian image, but with this additional symbolic dimension, she is, the two of them are a synthesis ever present of Christianity, illustrating some of the most important aspects that we know of in Christianity. We are elevated, but that can happen only if God descends and becomes one of ours. I took a lot of your time, sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for speaking on this topic. I was just wondering, with your development historically, if you thought that the development of photography influenced any of the particular art that you focused on this evening.
Whether it is, I don't know, but I understand the question exactly. Mm-hmm.
Well, the time period that you spoke of here was also a huge time period in the history of photography. And I was wondering if certain artists, or the way that they looked at it, or the way they focused on the mother and child, or on the images of Mary, if you found any correlations between that.
Between, if you want, the theological image of Mary and the... Well, I tried at the very beginning to show that there is a correspondence between the two of them. When you look at, with the 6 trends of theology at the end of our period is, you find a very high degree of correspondence in terms of seeking the essential element, in terms of a more integrated image in culture and different different situations, sociological, for instance, in terms of the importance of the growing importance of cultural images and inculturation, therefore, and so on and so forth, especially also if you want the alternance between, on the one hand, a more down-to-earth, a more sensuous image, and a more spiritualized image on the other hand. Maybe it didn't come through very clearly all the time, but there is a definite correspondence between what I discovered in terms of theological trends and the artistic development.
Thank you so much, Father Roten, for your lecture tonight. I have a question about the Epinal images. Now, you call it art for the heart, but I remember when I was in grade school and we would get the holy card sometimes, and they also had a kind of a catechetical function, and I was wondering if you could say something about the phenomena of holy cards, and if I thought you mentioned at the beginning that at Epinal that they are still being produced and that there's been a kind of revival in their popularity. Could you say something more about that?
First of all, I think that we should make a distinction between Epinal, as I presented it, and some of the holy cards, because toward the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, the so-called Epinal art was, how do you say, became cheaper and cheaper, meaning more of what we call kitsch than what Epinal was at one time, and seems to become again. If you compare, what I showed you in terms of the early images or first images, and we're getting there soon. This here, for instance, is no longer the typical Epinal art. That's a typical holy card of, if you're on the beginning of the 20th century. Whereas if you look at this here, these are the images which come back, and they are of a higher quality on the one hand. On the other hand, they are also more expressive of different things. Didactically, they have a good, chance to survive because they give you a prayer, a particular style, a particular type of and motif of the art. So I believe that what you have in front of you is, as a matter of fact, very expensive, if I may use that expression, right now, and very popular, something that comes back. Not least because of the coloring schemes, or if you want, the flowers around the pictures, that makes them very, very acceptable to many people. Whereas the other one is too much of a watered down Epinal picture. That's the reason why it is rejected, but I think that more and more people want something that is high in color, very attractive, not so much, a picture we have to think about, but a picture that speaks to the heart, or if you want, to the affectivity. Mm-hmm. Sure. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.